They called her the consolation prize. Not to her face, nobody in the Varro crime family had the nerve to do that. But Nessa Holt heard it anyway. She heard it in the way the women at the engagement party turned their shoulders just slightly when she walked past. She heard it in the silence that fell over the table when someone made a joke about Matteo finally settling down, and then scrambled to recover when they realized she was standing 2 feet away. She heard it in her own mother's voice, 3 days before the wedding, when the woman had grabbed her hand across the kitchen table and said, with the kind of tenderness that only makes things worse, "Just be grateful, sweetheart. Men like him don't usually look twice at girls like you." Nessa hadn't said anything. She'd finished her coffee, rinsed her mug, and driven home. She'd been hearing some version of that sentence her entire life, and she had learned, the way you learn to stop touching a hot stove, that arguing with it was a waste of breath. Not because it was true, but because the people who said it weren't ready to be wrong. Matteo Varro was 38 years old, the head of the Varro Syndicate's Eastern operations, and the kind of man who walked into a room and made every other man in it recalibrate. Not because he was loud. Because he wasn't. He had the particular stillness of someone who had never needed to raise his voice to be heard, and a face that looked like it had been carved by someone with a grudge against softness. Dark eyes, a jaw that could cut glass. The kind of effortless physical authority that women in the underworld's orbit spent their whole lives orbiting like satellites, hoping to get close enough to feel the gravity. He'd chosen Nessa for none of those reasons. She knew that. She'd known it from the moment his lawyer had called her family with the proposal. And she used that word deliberately because that's what it was, a proposal in the business sense, a contract with terms and conditions and a mutual benefit clause. Her uncle had connections Matteo needed quiet access to. The marriage was the access. Clean, simple, transactional. What nobody had bothered to explain to the people whispering at the engagement party was that Nessa had read the contract before she signed it. She had read it, annotated it, sent back 17 suggested revisions, and had 2 of them accepted. She was not a consolation prize. She was a negotiator who happened to be wearing a size 18 dress. The wedding itself was exactly what you'd expect from a man who treated everything like a logistics problem, efficient, expensive, attended by people who smiled like they were billing by the hour. Nessa stood at the altar in a gown she had chosen herself, midnight blue, not white, because she was 31 years old and had never been the type to perform innocence she didn't feel, and watched Matteo walk toward her with the focused expression of a man who was mentally reviewing a checklist. He looked at her face when he reached her, not her body, not her dress, her face, and something in his expression shifted, just slightly, just for a second, in a way she couldn't quite read. She filed it away. She was good at filing things away. The reception was worse. The women were polite in the way that sharp things are polite. Carefully, so they don't cut themselves. His cousin's wife, a woman named Darla, who wore the kind of smile that had probably been surgically installed, leaned over the table at one point and said, in a voice dripping with calculated sweetness, "You know, it's so refreshing that Matteo chose someone real, someone the rest of us can actually relate to." Nessa had taken a slow sip of her champagne, set it down, looked at Darla with the particular expression she'd developed over years of being underestimated, the one that was perfectly pleasant on the surface and utterly without mercy underneath. "That's funny," she said. "He told me he chose me because I was the smartest person he'd met in 4 years. But sure, real works too." She picked up her glass again and turned back to her plate. Darla did not speak to her again for the rest of the evening. Matteo, who had been 2 seats away and had heard every word, did not look at her. But she noticed, because she noticed everything, that the corner of his mouth moved. The house was in Metairie, just outside New Orleans, a white columned place that had been built in the 1890s and renovated by someone with excellent taste and too much money. Nessa had 5 rooms to herself on the 2nd floor. Matteo had the east wing. There was an entire hallway between them, which was fine. She had books. She had a research project she'd been putting off for 2 years. She had every intention of being a perfectly cordial and completely self-sufficient roommate in an arrangement that suited them both. She was not expecting to like him. She was particularly not expecting to like him at 6:45 on a Tuesday morning, standing in the kitchen in a shirt that hadn't been ironed and reading the financial section of the newspaper like he was looking for someone to argue with. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "Coffee's made," he said. "I can see that," she said. She poured herself a cup. He went back to his newspaper. She sat down at the other end of the kitchen island and opened her laptop. They stayed like that for 40 minutes, working in parallel, and it was the most comfortable she had felt in 6 months. That was how it started. Not with romance, with parallel quiet. She learned things about him in pieces, the way you learn a neighborhood by walking different streets. He didn't eat breakfast before 9, but he always made coffee at 6:30. He read 3 newspapers and trusted none of them. He had an opinion about every piece of architecture they drove past, and zero self-consciousness about sharing it. He called his mother every Sunday at noon, and was, for those 20 minutes, an entirely different version of himself, softer around the edges, almost boyish, patient in a way she never saw anywhere else. He learned things about her too, she could tell. He watched her the way people watch something they're trying to figure out. Not predatory, just precise. He noticed when she moved furniture 6 inches to the left because the light was better. He noticed that she kept 3 books going at once and finished all of them. He noticed that she went quiet when she was angry rather than loud, and that her quiet was more dangerous than other people's loud. One night, about 6 weeks in, he came home at 2 in the morning with a split lip and didn't explain it. She was still up, reading, and she looked at him over the top of her book. "Kitchen," she said. "Sit." He sat. She got ice and a clean cloth and antiseptic and dealt with his face with the brisk efficiency of someone who had grown up with brothers. He watched her the whole time. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he asked. "My uncle ran a boxing gym," she said. "I used to tape hands on Saturday mornings when I was 12. That where you learned to throw a punch, too?" She looked at him. "What makes you think I know how to throw a punch?" He looked back at her. "The way you carry yourself. Like you know exactly how much damage you can do if you decide to." She pressed the ice pack against his lip a little harder than necessary. He didn't flinch. That was the night she stopped thinking of this as a transaction and started thinking of it as something she didn't have a word for yet. The trouble started, as trouble usually does in that world, with ego. Matteo ran his operations with a precision that other families found variously impressive and infuriating. He didn't make flashy moves. He didn't need to. The Varro name alone was enough to hold territory that lesser men would have had to fight for every quarter. He had spent 15 years building a structure that was nearly airtight. Supply lines, political connections, financial instruments that would have impressed a legitimate hedge fund. Nearly airtight. The crack was a man named Reeves Colton. Reeves ran a crew out of Baton Rouge who had been paying tribute to the Varro family for 11 years without incident. He was competent, predictable, and had always understood where the lines were. But somewhere in the past 8 months, Nessa tracked it later, back to almost the exact date that the New Orleans territory had changed hands, Reeves had started to believe that the Varro operation was softer than it used to be. He wasn't entirely wrong. Matteo had made a deliberate choice in the past year to consolidate rather than expand, to pull back from the kind of visible enforcement that drew attention to run quieter. It was smart strategy. But to men like Reeves, quiet looked like weakness. And then Matteo had married a plus-size librarian from Covington, whose only visible qualification was an uncle with shipping connections. And Reeves Colton had decided he was looking at a man who had gone soft from the inside out. Nessa knew all of this before Matteo did. She knew it because she had, in the 6 weeks since the wedding, quietly made herself useful in ways that nobody had asked her to. She spoke 4 languages, 2 of them not widely known to be in her repertoire. She had a graduate degree in economics and had spent 4 years working in international logistics, which was, it turned out, an extraordinarily useful background for understanding exactly how a criminal supply chain worked. She read everything. She listened to more than she appeared to, and she had a talent which she had always considered a minor one, but which turned out to be worth considerably more in this world, for making people underestimate her so completely that they said things in her presence that they would never have said in front of someone they took seriously. Reeves Colton's second-in-command had said several of those things at a dinner party 2 weeks prior. He had said them while standing 4 feet away from Nessa, who had been examining the bookshelf in the host's study and was, to his eye, simply a large, quiet woman who had tagged along with her powerful husband and probably couldn't follow the conversation. He had said them to someone else, but Nessa had filed them away. She brought what she'd heard to Matteo on a Thursday evening, sitting across from him at his desk, and laid it out the way she laid everything out, clean, organized, without drama. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "How did you get this?" he asked. "I was standing next to a man who thought I was furniture," she said. "It's not the first time." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What would you recommend?" It was the first time he had asked her that, not the last. What Reeves Colton had decided to do, and what Matteo now knew he had decided, was not a clean move. It wasn't a direct challenge, the kind you could meet with a direct answer. It was more surgical than that. Reeves intended to go after the shipping connections that Nessa's uncle provided, not through violence but through business. A competing contract, better terms, a quiet campaign to make the Varro supply line obsolete. And then, once the financial structure started to creak, to make a play for the territory. It was actually, Nessa thought, a pretty intelligent plan. She said so. Matteo looked at her like she'd said something unexpected. "You're impressed by the man trying to undermine us?" "I'm impressed by competent strategy," she said. "It doesn't mean I'm going to let it work." She had already drafted a counter-proposal. She slid it across the desk. He read it. "Read it again. Set it down." "When did you write this?" "Yesterday, while you were in the meeting I wasn't invited to." He looked up. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not quite surprise, but close to it. Like a man recalibrating. "You should have been in that meeting," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "I should have." He nodded slowly. "That changes next week." It did. For 3 weeks, things moved the way well-laid plans move, steadily, almost quietly, piece by piece. Matteo countered Reeves' financial maneuvering with a series of moves that Nessa had helped structure, and twice she caught something that the rest of his team had missed. Once a discrepancy in a shipping manifest, once a third party who was playing both sides of a negotiation and had almost gotten away with it. His people noticed. They didn't say much, because they were not the type of people who said much, but she felt the shift, the way they held doors a half-second longer, the way they stopped looking past her when she walked into a room. Matteo noticed too. She could tell by the way he watched her in rooms where he thought she wasn't watching him back. She always was. Things were almost simple. Then the house alarm tripped at 11:47 on a Friday night, and Nessa realized that Reeves Colton had decided to stop being subtle. She heard it before she fully processed it. The soft, systematic click of the downstairs security panel going dark. Not the alarm going off, the alarm being cut, which was worse. She'd been in the sitting room off the main hall, reading, feet tucked under her. Halfway through a chapter she was going to have to reread because her mind kept drifting. She was on her feet before she'd consciously made the decision to stand. She knew 3 things immediately. 1. Matteo was 2 floors up, on a call, and the sound hadn't reached him yet. 2. The security team's overnight post was in the carriage house at the back of the property, which meant 45 seconds minimum before anyone realized what had happened. 3. She was in the room closest to the front of the house, between the door and the stairs. She did not waste time. Her uncle had not just run a boxing gym. Her uncle had been, before his retirement, a man who understood that the people he loved existed in a world where being able to defend yourself was not optional. He had taught Nessa to shoot when she was 14 and to think tactically when she was 16, and she had spent 4 years telling herself she would never need any of it. She had been wrong, and she was grateful. The gun was in the side table drawer. It had been there since day 2 of her marriage, because she had asked Matteo's security chief where the nearest one was, and he had blinked at her, and then, after a pause, pointed her toward the safe in the study. She had relocated it without explanation. Nobody had argued. 3 men came through the front door. She already wasn't there. What she had that they didn't was the house. She had spent 6 weeks learning it the way she learned everything, thoroughly, quietly, without making it a performance. She knew which floorboards gave and which didn't. She knew the sight lines from every doorway. She knew that the main hall had a chandelier that threw specific shadows at night, and she knew exactly where you had to stand to be invisible in them. She also knew that the men who came through the door were professionals, not the kind who hesitated, not the kind who made noise, but the kind who moved in patterns. Trained patterns. And trained patterns, once you understood them, were predictable. The first man made it to the bottom of the stairs before she was behind him. It was not a fair fight. She did not particularly care about fair. What she cared about was that Matteo was at the top of those stairs, and no one was going to get to him. She took down the first man with the cold efficiency of someone who had not forgotten what her uncle taught her. The second came from the east corridor, and she was already moving, already repositioning, already 3 seconds ahead of where he expected her to be. He was bigger than her. He was faster than her. He had probably significantly more recent combat experience than her. He had not expected her at all. That was the thing. She had heard it all her life. Too big, too slow, too much, and every person who had ever looked at her and seen a liability had made the same mistake. They had let what they saw tell them what to expect. They had decided, looking at her, that they already knew what she was capable of. They never did. The third man was coming from the direction of the kitchen, and she heard him slow when he saw the hallway, heard the hitch in his movement that meant he'd found his colleagues and was recalculating. She moved before he finished recalculating. It was over in 4 minutes. She was standing in the middle of the front hall, breathing harder than she'd like, when she heard footsteps on the stairs. Not the careful footsteps of a threat. The rapid, controlled footsteps of a man who had realized something was happening in his house and was coming toward it instead of away from it. Matteo stopped at the bottom of the stairs. He looked at the hall. He looked at the 3 men on the floor. He looked at Nessa. She became aware, in that moment, that her hair was a disaster, that she was still holding the gun, and that she was wearing the giant green cardigan that she put on every night because it was comfortable, and she genuinely did not care what it looked like. Matteo looked at all of this. "Are you hurt?" he said. "No, are they? Alive? I wasn't trying to kill anyone." She paused. "I was trying not to let anyone get upstairs." He was quiet for a moment. The particular quiet she had come to recognize as the one that meant he was processing something significant. "There were 3 of them," he said. "I noticed, and I had the house," she said simply. "They didn't." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he crossed the hall, not fast, not slow, and stood directly in front of her, and took the gun out of her hand very gently and set it on the side table, and then he put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her like she was something he was only just now seeing clearly. "Nessa," he said. "Matteo," she said, "I owe you an apology." She raised an eyebrow. "For what, specifically?" "For not understanding the first time I met you, what you were, and what am I?" He looked at her for one more long moment. "The most dangerous persons in this house," he said. "And I mean that as the most sincere compliment I have ever paid anyone." She considered that. "You know what I was doing," she said, "before they came through the door." "What?" "Reading. I was 4 chapters from the end." She looked at the hallway, at the general chaos of it. "I'm going to have to start the chapter over now." For the first time since she'd met him, Matteo Varro laughed like he meant it. Not the controlled smile she'd seen at meetings, not the polished courtesy he deployed at dinners. A real laugh, full and unguarded, from somewhere deep in his chest. It was, she thought, an excellent sound. Reeves Colton was dealt with, quietly the way Matteo dealt with most things, but with a finality that left no room for misinterpretation. The men who had come through the front door were traced back to their employer within 48 hours, and the conversation that followed, which Nessa was present for, because Matteo had made it clear that she was present for everything now, left Reeves with a very simple choice. He made the right one. The story spread through the families the way stories do, sideways in pieces, dressed up and embellished until it was half legend. A three-man hit squad, the Varro wife. Nobody had seen her coming. Darla cornered her at a family dinner 3 weeks later, her smile surgical as ever, and said, "I heard what happened. I have to say, I never would have guessed." Nessa looked at her pleasantly. "That's sort of the whole point," she said. She went to find Matteo, who was across the room in conversation with 2 of his uncles and the family attorney, and she put her hand on his arm because she felt like it, and he shifted slightly to include her in the circle without breaking his sentence. And one of his uncles looked at her with something that had shifted from skepticism to something quieter and more like respect. 6 months ago, she had driven home from her mother's kitchen table and thought about a sentence that had been said to her. "Men like him don't usually look twice at girls like you." She thought about Matteo, who looked at her like she was the only thing in a room worth looking at. Who had said, standing in a wrecked hallway at midnight, that she was the most dangerous person in his house, and had meant it as a love letter. She thought about all the rooms she had walked into, all the shoulders that had turned, all the versions of "don't get your hopes up, sweetheart, be realistic, be grateful, be smaller." Every single one of them delivered by someone who had looked at her and thought they already knew everything they needed to know. She thought, they never do. The thing about being underestimated, she had always believed, was that it was only a disadvantage if you let it surprise you. If you expected it, if you've planned around it, if you learned to move inside it like a room you knew by heart, it stopped being a disadvantage entirely. It became something else. It became the thing nobody saw coming. She stayed at Matteo's side all evening, and she talked to his people, and she listened to twice as much as she said, and she filed away 17 things that would be useful later. When they drove home at midnight through the warm, wet dark of a New Orleans summer, the city lights smearing gold through the rain on the window, Matteo reached across the console and took her hand without looking away from the road. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. She didn't need him to. She already knew.